What do you think of the MAGA movement itself? I mean, let's say if Trump does not follow through on his promises, he talked about basically helping out the average worker. He talked about changing things on foreign policy, sort of painting himself as the president of peace, being against wars. What if he doesn't follow through on that? I mean, do you think? I mean, the sort of the prevailing view of the MAGA movement from like liberals is that they're basically a cult. That no matter what Trump does, they're not going to hold him to account. You've been around MAGA spaces a little bit. I mean, what's your sense of that?
It reminds me of like how Joseph Stalin used to have all this propaganda about how bad segregation in America was. And like it's almost, when you think about that, there's almost like two conflicting views that you have. So like at least my first impulse is to be like, Joseph Stalin, like who are you? You really care about human rights abuses or something like that? But like, okay, once you get past that hypocrisy, you like, okay, he does have a point about segregation. It's pretty messed up. You know what I mean? And so I think that when you hear it from the corporate media or from Democrats that they're like, oh, these MAGA guys are totally in a cult, the first impulse is to be like, I mean, who are you guys to call anyone in a cult? I mean, like literally Joe Biden, one day before the debate, everybody is going, oh, it's cheap fakes and it's right-wing propaganda that he's too old to do this. And the next day, it's all accepted and we're all just worshiping Kamala Harris and, at least for a couple months there, pretending she's joy and hope. And so if anyone's guilty of cult-like behavior, it's that side is probably the worst offenders.
I call them Blue-Anon. I call them Blue-Anon because, and that started with them believing in a conspiracy theory that Donald Trump was controlled by, conspiring with, and being blackmailed by Russia. So, hey.
Yeah, 100%. So like that totally applies. I think that's exactly right. That being said, look, there is a little bit of truth to that. And I've noticed this over the years of, I ended up supporting Trump in this last election, but I've been a pretty strong critic of his for the last 8 years. And I've argued with a lot of people who it is kind of unbelievable how much there'll be a dynamic where like, there'll be a Trump supporter who completely agrees with me on the policy. And then I could look at them and be like, okay, but look, Donald Trump did this, which is like the exact, like just something, for example, like, okay, you think Fauci's a criminal and totally corrupt and lockdowns were wrong and all of that. Okay, well, Donald Trump's the one who kept him on the job through all of 2020. And then the excuses just come at he was tricked, he was duped, it's 4D chess. So like there is this dynamic amongst Trump supporters where he has built up a bit of a cult of personality. This is probably true for all presidential candidates. I do think there's at least a percentage, I don't know exactly what it is, but a percentage of Trump supporters who just like are going to agree with him no matter what. And they may sound really good. If Donald Trump says we don't want to fight these wars anymore, they might be like, that's right, we don't want to. But as soon as he starts moving toward a war with Iran, they're going to catch his back and say he's got to do this and he's smart and that's why this is a good war. One of the things that I'm more interested in is that Donald Trump only has one term. There's 4 years here that we got Donald Trump, and then there's a huge question mark as to like what the future of this movement's going to be. And one of the things that I think was kind of interesting about that, like the H-1B visa debate, is that it seems to me like nobody else except Donald Trump in this world gets that treatment. Elon Musk doesn't, Vivek Ramaswamy doesn't, like I just think so. Once Trump's gone, maybe there'll be like a more open conversation about some of these things. And aside from that, I mean, I really don't know. It kind of depends on what Trump does and how much people are able to convince MAGA supporters that like this really is not a good policy. And one thing I am sure of, and I do think it's better that he won than if Kamala Harris had won, but I am sure that there are going to be disappointments and bad policy decisions. And I'm sure that I'm going to be finding out what the answer to this question is in real time as I, at some point, inevitably in a few months, am arguing with MAGA people about what a mistake Donald Trump just made. Hopefully I'm not.
When you say he's the only one who gets this treatment and Vivek and Elon don't, you're saying like the treatment being unwavering support?
Yeah. I mean, well, look, even think about how intense the kind of MAGA on Twitter was going at Elon Musk and going at Vivek Ramaswamy. But Donald Trump also changed his tune on the H-1B visas, and he's not getting the same treatment. Like he's the guy at the top, and somehow they're still blaming the people surrounding him. And if he does get it wrong, then that's evidence that he had the wrong people around him. They poisoned his mind. They gave him misinformation, whatever it is. It's like, but he just seems to, this is why they call him Teflon Don. I mean, there is something amazing. There's a quality to him that I've never seen any other human being have. My favorite example of it always was, if you guys remember this moment in the primary debates in 2016, where it was when Rand Paul, who was my guy in the race, didn't do that good. But he was still in it. And Donald Trump just started, they asked him something about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and Donald Trump started railing against China's currency manipulation. And the problem with the TPP is it doesn't address China's currency manipulation, and going on and on. And then Rand Paul just raises his hand. No moderator said anything, but Rand Paul just raises his hand and he goes, shouldn't someone point out that China isn't in the TPP? And with no hesitation, not one step backward, Donald Trump just goes, Rand Paul, what are you at, like 1%? That's why you're all the way over there. And you look at it and you're like, I think he won that exchange.
Yeah.
Somehow, even though he was just completely wrong. So he's got an ability to like not let anything stick to him, and his supporters help him in that.
Yeah, I always think that something that the left gets wrong about Trump or doesn't credit him with is that his non-ideology and non-consistency and non-principledness is like his biggest weapon, his biggest get out of jail free card, because no one really cares if he flip-flops. Like, I think what people who like him like about him is that he shoots from the hip. He's like presents himself as outside the system, even though we know he hasn't drained the swamp and mostly. So no one can really get him on his hypocrisy. And another debate that I always remember is when he was debating Hillary Clinton and he brought up the super predators comment, which is racist, coded racist language. But this is a guy who, took out an ad in the Daily News calling for the return of the death penalty in response to the Central Park Five. But again, he can do that. And that's what gives him so much power, because other people are kind of hamstrung by claims of consistency. So if they go from one thing to another, then they can be called out for their hypocrisy. But Trump can't be, because his hypocrisy is almost like not hypocritical, whereas the hypocrisy of other people is hypocritical.
Yeah, man, I'm blanking on the name of this piece. Oh man, I really wish I had a better memory. But Noam Chomsky had this piece back in the day. I think it was like in the 70s. He wrote it. But it was really, really interesting. Where I don't know if either of you guys will remember this, but he was talking about how it was an article about public intellectuals, and he was making the argument that like public businessmen are actually better public intellectuals than public intellectuals, which is a very already kind of interesting from Noam Chomsky to be making this argument. But he was kind of making the point that like if you're a public intellectual and you got something wrong, then in order to admit that you got it wrong, you have to tear down your entire house of credibility, because that's your whole calling card, is that you get this stuff right. So if you admit you're wrong, then why should we ever listen to you again? Whereas if the reason we're listening to you is because you built great big factories and you get something wrong, you could admit you're wrong because you're still the guy who built great big factories. And so anyway, there's like an interesting dynamic to that. And I think some aspect of that like aids Donald Trump, where it's like, well, he's there because he's Donald Trump. He's the most famous rich guy ever. So he could, and then he's just always on every side of every issue. Right. So in some ways, he's always being consistent and he's always being a hypocrite, because it's like, well, even back to 2016, it's like, we're going to end the wars. We're not going to fight the wars anymore, but we're going to take the oil and we're going to get all the terrorists and we're going to torture their families. And so like, what was his position exactly on the, like, I don't know, but there is something, and I'm sure both of you guys feel this too, as I do. There's something cathartic about Donald Trump, because like in his weird stream of conscious, I don't have a filter style, he will blurt out the truth sometimes. Right. And he's like the only guy who's ever been in the position he's in. I mean, there were like a few other guys, like Dennis Kucinich and Ron Paul used to tell the truth sometimes, but they didn't have like billions of dollars or weren't world famous. They didn't have, and for those reasons, didn't have real shots of winning the presidency. But Donald Trump is actually a guy who's won it twice now. And every now and then he'll just, there's moments that I just think of in my mind, when Bill O'Reilly, was pinning him down on how Vladimir Putin's a killer. And he goes, yeah, we got a lot of killers too. And Bill O'Reilly's like, what are you talking about? And he goes, well, how about the war in Iraq? And he goes, well, that was a mistake. And Donald Trump goes, yeah, okay, a mistake. It's just like, oh my God, that's the greatest thing that's ever happened. It's just so amazing that someone looked Bill O'Reilly in the face, that someone looked Jeb Bush in the face and just told them the truth. And so, unfortunately, that's the situation we're in. It's like a Greek tragedy or something, but that's what we get. That's the best we have right now, is that sometimes he will tell the truth.